That night, my daughter placed a thick folder in front of me. The heading on the first page read, "Transfer of Assets." Her voice was cold, sharp, and stripped of all warmth. "If you don't sign this, Mother, you will lose everything. My name is Margaret Ellison. I am 67 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and the widow of Jonathan Ellison. For 4 decades, I stood quietly by his side as he built a fortune through patience, discipline, and investments that grew year after year. When he passed away last spring, his will placed everything in my hands. The lawyer confirmed it without hesitation. The bank made it official. Jonathan's will gave me full control of his $52 million portfolio. But that night, in my daughter's pristine modern living room, it wasn't love or grief that filled the air. It was lemon polish. The glare of cold LED light. The sterile emptiness of a house that looked more like a showroom than a home. The walnut table stretched between us, long and dark. On one side sat Charlotte, my only child, the girl I once sang to sleep when fevers racked her little body. Now she was a 40-year-old executive, polished and ambitious, her nails tapping against the folder as if each sound was a countdown. "You don't understand investments," she said flatly. "I do. Sign it and I'll handle everything. You'll be taken care of. But if you refuse, you are no longer part of this family." Her words struck harder than the storm beating against the windows. My hand trembled. I picked up the pen and felt its weight. For a moment I thought of Jonathan. I remembered his steady voice when he told me, "Margaret, money is only a tool. The compass is yours." I looked at the signature line. My name was already typed there, waiting to be erased by my own weakness. Betrayal chilled my bones. Still, instead of signing, I pushed the folder back across the table. No. Just one word, but it filled the room like a tide crashing against the shore. Charlotte's lips parted. Her eyes narrowed. She stood without another word, her face shadowed by something I had never seen in her before. Not disappointment. Not sadness. But calculation. That night she locked me out of my own house. And in that moment I understood, the battle ahead was not about money. It was about dignity, memory, and the invisible line that decides who we become when family chooses greed over love. What happened the next day when she returned expecting to crush me, only to find the lawyer, the banker, and our old family friends standing at my side? That was the moment everything turned. But before I tell you how it all unfolded, let me pause here. If you believe stories like mine should be heard, if you believe in standing your ground even when you feel utterly alone, then I invite you to like this story, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. It helps share these voices with others who might be walking through their own storms. Because sometimes the quietest no is the loudest thing you can say. I often wonder if my path was already set the day I met Jonathan. I was 22, fresh out of teacher training, hurrying down Main Street with a stack of children's books in my arms. He stood outside a small brokerage office, his tie slightly crooked, his hair tousled by the wind. His briefcase was scuffed and old, but his words were clear. "People chase luck," he said casually, nodding toward a group of young men boasting about racetrack winnings. "But I believe in patience. Long-term investing, not chance." I smiled politely, ready to keep walking. But something in his eyes stopped me. They were steady, almost stubborn, the eyes of a man who valued consistency more than cleverness. I didn't know then that his principles, patience, discipline, faith in the long run, would become the foundation of our life together. I was a schoolteacher living on a modest salary. Every penny mattered. I clipped coupons, baked bread at home, and patched Charlotte's dresses long after she'd outgrown them. Jonathan, meanwhile, worked long nights at the brokerage, poring over reports, circling companies in his notebooks, sketching charts that only he seemed to understand. He was never reckless. If Jonathan bought a stock, it was because he had studied it for months, sometimes years. He used to say, The market is like a tide. You don't force it. You wait for it to rise. Our marriage was simple, never glamorous. We shared coffee at dawn before I left for school. He would stir his with too much sugar and I would tease him about it. He always winked and said, "Sweetness keeps the nerves steady." I watched him grow from a clerk into a financial advisor, and then into a careful investor who built a portfolio brick by brick. Behind his ambition I stood quietly. I left my career when Charlotte was born, deciding that our daughter needed one steady parent at home. My days became filled with lesson plans abandoned for laundry, grocery lists, and bedtime stories. My hands shaped the rhythm of the household. My voice soothed fevers in the night. Jonathan would often come home exhausted, but his eyes always softened when they found me, as though he believed I was the true foundation of our family. One winter morning, as we sat at our small kitchen table with steam rising from our mugs, he reached across and touched my hand. "Margaret," he whispered, "one day when I'm gone all of this will be yours. Because you're the one who keeps the heartbeat steady, not me." I laughed at his dramatic tone, brushing it off, but his eyes held no doubt. And for the rest of his life he kept that promise. Years passed with their quiet rhythm. Charlotte grew and Jonathan's portfolio expanded. We celebrated birthdays not with lavish parties but with small gestures. A scarf he chose for me. A set of books I found for him. On our 25th anniversary he gave me a gray wool scarf, saying, "It will keep you warm when I cannot." I wore it often, never imagining how soon that day would come. It happened suddenly. One bright spring morning, Jonathan collapsed in the garden while trimming the hedges. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. A massive heart attack had taken him before I could even hold his hand one last time. The scarf hung on the coat rack by the door. I remember clutching it to my chest as if the fabric could hold my heart together. The funeral was quiet, heavy with grief. Friends from the brokerage came, men with polished shoes and solemn faces, speaking in hushed tones about Jonathan's reliability. I wore the gray scarf, its wool scratching against my neck, but I couldn't bear to remove it. Charlotte sat beside me, rigid, her phone tucked into her purse, buzzing faintly every few minutes. She didn't weep. She stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, her lips pressed thin. I wondered what might be stirring in her heart, but she gave nothing away. 2 weeks later, I sat in the wood-paneled office of Marcus Bennett, our family lawyer for more than 20 years. The air smelled faintly of leather and old paper. Marcus adjusted his glasses, opened a folder, and read Jonathan's will in his steady, deliberate voice. "I, Jonathan Edward Ellison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby leave all financial assets, including but not limited to my stock portfolio, currently valued at approximately $52 million, solely to my wife, Margaret Ellison." The words echoed in my ears. My hands gripped the arms of the chair as though the ground beneath me had shifted. Jonathan had done exactly what he promised that winter morning so many years ago. Charlotte sat across from me, silent. Her face was pale, her hands gripping her leather handbag so tightly her knuckles whitened. Marcus went on, noting that Jonathan had provided for her generously during her adult life and saw no need for further provisions. The silence that followed was heavier than the words themselves. I glanced at my daughter, searching for even a flicker of tenderness, but her eyes were fixed on the folder, dark and unblinking. In that moment I understood two truths at once. Jonathan had trusted me with everything we had built, and Charlotte was not ready to accept it. One gift, one burden, both placed on my shoulders in the same breath. When I left Charlotte's house that night, I told myself I was returning to the safety of my own home. The drive was short. The streets glistened under the drizzle, and for a fleeting moment, I thought perhaps the worst had passed. But when I pressed my key card against the electronic lock of my front door, the small screen flashed red. Access denied. I tried again. Once, twice. I even tilted the card at different angles, hoping it was just a sensor malfunction. Each time the same cold words appeared. Access denied. It wasn't the card that had failed. It was Charlotte. The rain quickened, soaking my coat. My suitcase, packed with trembling hands, rested at my feet. I looked up at the darkened windows of my own house, the home where Jonathan and I had spent our last years together. I thought of the mornings he brewed coffee, the evenings we played cards at the kitchen table, the quiet rhythm of our ordinary days. And now I stood outside like a stranger. I reached for my phone, the first impulse to call Charlotte and demand an explanation. But I stopped myself. I could already hear her voice in my head, cool and dismissive. Mother, it's for your own good. You can stay somewhere else until you decide to sign. Not an apology, not even an acknowledgement of cruelty, just a justification wrapped in authority. I slipped the phone back into my purse and steadied my breathing. The rain ran down my face, cold and insistent. Yet in that moment, a memory broke through. Jonathan's voice, calm and protective, came to me. Years earlier, while we were cleaning out the attic together, he had said with a half smile, "If the day ever comes when you feel pushed out, Margaret, go to the cottage by the lake. That place will always open its arms to you." The cottage. It had been ours for decades, though rarely used in recent years. A modest cabin tucked near the waterline, cedar beams and windows that looked out over a silver sheet of lake. Jonathan loved it for its quiet. I loved it because it felt timeless. In that instant, drenched on the front step of my locked house, I knew where I had to go. I pulled the suitcase into the car, tossed my wet coat onto the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel. The engine started with a low rumble, almost reluctant, as if it too understood the weight of the journey ahead. I turned onto the highway, rain slashing harder against the windshield. Each swipe of the wipers revealed the dark road stretching forward, endless and uncertain. The suitcase shifted with each curve. On top of it sat the gray wool scarf Jonathan had given me years ago. Damp now, smelling faintly of rain and old wool, but I held it close, wrapping it around my shoulders. It was the only warmth I had, a reminder that somewhere in all this betrayal, I still carried pieces of him. The drive took more than an hour, though it felt like an entire night. My hands clenched the wheel, knuckles pale under the glow of the dashboard lights. I passed long stretches of forest where the trees bent under the storm and towns sleeping behind darkened windows. The further I went, the more the past seemed to slip away. The classroom chalkboards, the bustling brokerage, even the years of Sunday dinners with Charlotte, they all blurred behind me, left in the rain. Inside the car, I spoke quietly to myself, words I barely recognized as my own. You are not finished. You are not helpless. You are still Margaret. Saying it out loud steadied me. It felt like stepping across an invisible line, leaving behind the role of obedient mother and widow, and stepping into something I did not yet know how to name. When I finally turned down the narrow road that led to the cottage, the rain softened into a mist. The headlights caught the outline of the cedar roof, dark against the lake beyond. I pulled into the gravel drive, shut off the engine and sat for a moment in silence. My chest rose and fell, heavy but steady. I picked up the suitcase, climbed the porch steps and slid the old brass key into the lock. It turned easily without resistance. The door creaked open and a rush of warm, woody air greeted me, carrying the faint scent of cedar and thyme. I stepped inside, dripping, tired yet strangely steady. That night, standing in the threshold of that cottage, I understood what had happened. Charlotte had cut me off, shut me out of my own life. But she had also pushed me into something new. I was no longer clinging to a house or to memories that refused to shelter me. I was walking through another doorway, one Jonathan had left waiting all along. As the rain whispered against the roof, I knew with absolute clarity that I had crossed a threshold. The life I once knew was over. A different one was just beginning. The brass key slid into the lock as if it had been waiting for me all these years. When the door opened, the smell of cedar and pine wrapped around me, warm and familiar like an embrace from the past. This cottage by the lake had been Jonathan's favorite retreat, though we hadn't spent much time here in later years. He used to call it our harbor of silence. I had almost forgotten how the floor creaked in the same places, how the air inside felt untouched, carrying only the scent of wood and thyme. I set my suitcase by the door and peeled off my wet coat. Drops of rain slid onto the wooden floor, but the cottage seemed to welcome even that. My eyes adjusted to the dim glow from the small lamp Jonathan had wired decades ago. Its yellow light cast soft shadows on the walls, catching on the old photographs we had once hung but never replaced. One showed Charlotte as a toddler on the dock, Jonathan holding her steady. Another captured me standing beside him during one of those rare vacations we could afford in the early years. The frames were dusty, yet the memories inside them had not faded. I walked toward the kitchen hoping to find a towel, and that was when I noticed it. On the oak table by the window sat an envelope, thick and sealed, my name written across the front in Jonathan's unmistakable handwriting. My breath caught. The ink had bled slightly at the edges as if it had been waiting a long time. My fingers trembled as I lifted it. The weight of the paper felt heavier than it should, carrying the presence of a man who was gone, but not entirely absent. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, the words written in his careful, deliberate script. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then the time I feared has come. You have always been the true keeper of this family. I built wealth. You built everything else. I know Charlotte may not understand and may turn against you. Do not face it alone. I have prepared a team for you. People I trust. People who will stand beside you. Marcus knows the law. Claire knows the banks. Thomas knows protection. Call on them. You will not have to fight by yourself. All my love, Jonathan." The words blurred as my eyes filled. I pressed the letter to my chest, the paper softening against the wool scarf that still clung damp around my shoulders. That scarf, gray and ordinary to anyone else, suddenly became my shield. Jonathan had given it to me on a cold anniversary morning, teasing that it would keep me warm when he could not. Tonight it felt like armor. I sank into the chair by the window, clutching the scarf with one hand and the letter with the other. Outside, the lake shimmered under the moonlight, ripples spreading in quiet patterns. The storm had passed, leaving only a mist curling low over the water. The sound of the waves lapping against the shore was steady, grounding, like a heartbeat I could lean on. My tears came quietly without sobs. I cried not only for Jonathan but for the life I thought I still had. The home I had been locked out of, the daughter who had turned into a stranger. Yet beneath the grief there was something else, something sharper. Resolve. Jonathan had seen what I had not dared to admit, that Charlotte's hunger for control would one day test me. And instead of leaving me defenseless, he had left me this. His words, his trust, his allies. It was as if he had built a bridge for me across the chasm of betrayal. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back into the envelope, and slid it inside my scarf as though tucking it close to my heart. The lamp flickered gently and I let my eyes wander to the lake. Its surface caught the pale glow of the moon, endless ripples fanning out like the chapters of a story just beginning. That night, as I sat by the window of the cottage, I realized I was no longer simply surviving the loss of Jonathan. I was stepping into the life he had prepared me to lead. A chapter had closed behind me. The locked door, the red words of access denied, the cold threat of my daughter's ultimatum. Ahead was a life shaped by my own hands, guided by his trust and strengthened by my resolve. Another chapter opened in front of me, the soft light of the cottage spilling across the floor, the letter in my hand, the promise of strength found not in anyone else but within myself. For the first time since Jonathan's death, I felt the faintest pulse of possibility. Not joy, not yet, but a beginning. A threshold crossed, a quiet certainty that the storm was behind me, and that the rippling lake outside was calling me forward into something new. Morning arrived with a pale mist curling off the water. I had not slept much. The chair by the window had become my bed, Jonathan's gray scarf still draped around my shoulders, the envelope pressed against my chest. My eyes were gritty from tears, but my spine felt straighter than it had the night before. I made a pot of coffee in the old percolator. Its hiss and gurgle steadied me. I was just setting the mug on the table when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Through the window I saw Charlotte's sleek black SUV pull into the drive. She stepped out with the purposeful stride of someone arriving to claim victory. Her heels clicked against the stones, her blazer pristine, her hair pulled tight as if to emphasize control. She looked at the cottage with a faint curl of her lip, as if it were a shed she would rather burn down than enter. She pushed open the door without knocking. "Mother," she said briskly, her eyes scanning the room. "You've made this much harder than it needed to be." She placed a leather folder on the table and snapped it open. "We can finish this today. Sign the documents and move back into your house. Otherwise, you will regret this." Before I could answer, another voice spoke. "I think we should clarify a few things before Margaret signs anything." Charlotte turned sharply. Seated at the far end of the table was Marcus Bennett, the family lawyer who had read Jonathan's will just weeks ago. His silver hair caught the morning light, glasses perched low on his nose as he spread several official papers across the table. "As executor, I must insist we respect Jonathan's clear intentions. Margaret is the sole heir. No transfer of assets will be forced without due process." Charlotte froze for a moment, then recovered. "Marcus," she said tightly, "this is a family matter. You don't need to involve yourself." "That's where you're mistaken," he replied firmly. Another voice joined in, warm but resolute. Claire Dawson stepped forward from the corner, holding a neat folder embossed with the logo of the bank where she had been a senior manager for 30 years. Claire had been my closest friend since college and had managed Jonathan's accounts for decades. "I've reviewed every share certificate, every transfer record," she said. "Everything is registered solely under Margaret's name. There is nothing for you to manage." Charlotte's expression faltered. Her eyes flicked between Marcus and Claire, irritation rising. "You can't just..." Before she could finish, a third voice cut in. Deep, steady, unhurried. "Charlotte, maybe you should think before you speak." Thomas Reed leaned against the doorframe, broad shoulders filling the space. He had been our neighbor for 20 years before retiring from the police force, a quiet man who rarely interfered. But Jonathan had trusted him, and so did I. He held up a small stack of credit card statements. "Remember these? The times you used your mother's supplementary card for personal expenses, vacations, jewelry, a down payment on that SUV, all while your father was alive. He forgave it. But don't stand here pretending you've sacrificed." Charlotte's face flushed red. "That's irrelevant," she snapped. "No," Marcus said, tapping the wool spread across the table. "It's entirely relevant. It shows your father's reasoning. He and Margaret had already provided for you. He chose deliberately to secure everything for her because he knew she would protect the integrity of what he built." For a long moment, silence filled the cottage. The air hummed with the quiet strength of three people who had stepped in unasked, yet unwavering. Charlotte had expected to find me alone, cornered, easy to bend. Instead, she faced a wall of evidence, loyalty, and truth. She turned her gaze on me at last, her voice low and trembling with anger. "You've turned them against me." I met Charlotte's eyes steadily, my hands resting lightly on Jonathan's scarf. My voice was calm, not sharp, not pleading, just firm. "No, Charlotte," I said. "You've turned against yourself. You're worried that I'm weak. But I'm worried about something else entirely. I'm worried about losing myself." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than anything the lawyer, the banker, or the retired policeman had said. For a moment she looked at me not as an adversary, not even as her mother, but as someone she could not move. Then her jaw tightened. She slammed the folder shut, gathered it under her arm, and without another word stormed out the door. The SUV roared down the gravel path, spraying stones. Inside the cottage, the silence returned. Marcus began stacking his papers. Claire closed her folder, and Thomas set the credit card statements aside. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight in my chest ease just slightly. For the first time since Jonathan's death, I realized I was not as alone as Charlotte wanted me to believe. Jonathan had been right. There was a team, a chosen family, and they were here. Not for the money, not for control, but for me. The storm did not end with Charlotte walking out of the cottage. If anything, that was only the beginning. Within days, whispers began to reach me. First through a friend who called hesitantly, then through sideways glances at the grocery store, and finally through the pointed silences at church. Charlotte had begun telling people I was no longer myself, that grief had unmade me, that I was slipping into confusion. "She isn't fit to manage anything," she had said. According to one neighbor who still had the courage to warn me, "Margaret is forgetful, fragile, maybe even unstable. Someone else needs to take over before she loses everything." It was a clever tactic. She knew that in a small town, reputation was as powerful as any contract. Once doubt takes root, it grows like ivy, silent, creeping, strangling. Friends I had known for years suddenly avoided my eyes. Some offered polite smiles edged with pity. Others turned away altogether. I could almost hear their thoughts. Maybe Charlotte is right. Maybe Margaret really is losing her mind. I will not lie. It stung. To walk into the post office and feel conversations pause. To catch fragments of sentences that dissolved the moment I turned. Those cuts are deeper than any blade. Grief had already hollowed me. Now suspicion threatened to erase me. But I refused to fight fire with fire. I did not march into town to defend myself. I did not send letters, post declarations, or beg anyone to believe me. Jonathan used to say, "When you explain too much, you lose more than words. You lose your footing." So I chose silence, not weakness, but silence as a shield. One afternoon, the truth of it all unfolded in the most ordinary place, the supermarket. I had gone in for milk, bread, and tea bags. The aisles were crowded with people preparing for a holiday weekend. As I waited at the checkout, I noticed Mrs. Cooper, a woman from 3 houses down, standing a few lanes over. She was talking to another neighbor, her eyes darting toward me with the same look I had seen all week, concern mixed with doubt. When it came time to pay, the cashier handed me the electronic ballot form for the town council election. My hands were steady as I signed my name, checked the boxes, and slid the form back. Nothing extraordinary, just a simple civic act I had done every year. Yet I caught Mrs. Cooper staring at me, her face softening. It was as if she had expected me to falter, to forget, to stumble in confusion. Instead, she saw me as I was, composed, deliberate, entirely aware. For a moment our eyes met. She looked away quickly, embarrassed, but I understood something important. Rumors are fragile. They cannot survive long when reality is steady, visible, undeniable. I walked out of the store with my groceries and Jonathan's scarf pulled tight around my neck. The whispers did not stop overnight. They never do. But I knew that silence paired with consistency would erode them faster than any shouting match ever could. I chose to let my actions speak, showing up at every meeting on time, paying every bill with precision, balancing my accounts with care. I lived as I always had, steady, measured, unwilling to surrender my dignity to noise. That night, back at the cottage, I sat by the window again, looking out over the lake. The water rippled with the same calm persistence I tried to carry in my own heart. I thought of Jonathan's words, of the team he had prepared for me, of the allies already standing at my side. Charlotte might have the louder voice in town, but I had something more enduring. I had truth, time, and the quiet strength of simply being who I had always been. And so, I did nothing to fight her smear campaign. Nothing except continue to be Margaret Ellison. Sometimes that is the most defiant thing you can do. The campaign had left its marks on me, though I did not show them. I kept my head high, walked through the market, paid my bills, carried on. Yet at night, when the cottage grew still, I felt the doubts pressing in like a tide. Am I strong enough? Am I steady enough to carry everything Jonathan left behind? Those questions sat heavy on my chest. One evening, while searching through the cottage desk for stationery, I found a leather-bound notebook tucked into the back of a drawer. It was scuffed at the edges, the kind Jonathan had used for years to jot down thoughts on investments, notes from meetings, reminders to himself. The sight of his handwriting, bold and neat, made my breath catch. I carried it to the table and opened it carefully, as though the pages might crumble if I moved too fast. The first entries were practical: lists of companies, dividends recorded in tidy rows, brief comments about market conditions. My fingertips traced his words as if touching them might bring him back. I turned page after page until I reached one that made me still. Charlotte asked again about selling the portfolio. She said it was too slow, too boring. She wanted to liquidate and put everything into real estate projects her friends were chasing. Jonathan wrote, "I worry she only sees the numbers, not the meaning. Margaret understands that these stocks are not just money. They are stability. They are patience made visible." My chest tightened. I kept reading. Another entry, dated only 2 years before he died. "I have always imagined giving this to Charlotte one day. I thought it could be her legacy. But today I overheard her at lunch. She said, 'I'll sell the whole lot. Who wants to waste decades waiting on dividends when you can flip properties and double your money in months?'" That was the moment I knew. He did not see what I saw. He did not feel what I felt. This was not for her. Must go to me. I sat frozen, my hand resting on the page. The words blurred and steadied again through my tears. Jonathan had nearly handed everything to Charlotte for years. He had believed she would be the one to carry it forward, and she might have been, had her vision been different. But in one careless moment she had revealed her truth. She saw only profit, never principle. I let out a long, unsteady breath. The room felt small, the air thick, as though the weight of what I was reading pressed in from every side. I pressed my palm against the ink, feeling the ridges where his pen had pressed into the paper. The silence of the cottage grew so deep I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant lap of the lake against the shore. Slowly I lowered my head until my forehead touched the notebook. My tears fell, not in sobs but in quiet drops that spotted the page. Not grief this time, not despair, something sharper, awakening. For so long, I had let Charlotte's accusations pierce me. I had let her threats echo in my mind. But here in Jonathan's own hand was the truth he had carried. He trusted me because I understood not just the numbers, not just the shares, but the meaning behind them. Every stock represented years of restraint, of choosing less now for more later. It was not just money. It was the story of our lives. I lifted my head and wiped my cheeks with the back of my hand. The tears that remained were not heavy anymore. They carried clarity, a reminder. Jonathan had not chosen me because he had no one else. He had chosen me because he believed I was the only one who would protect the integrity of what we had built. I closed the notebook gently and placed both hands on its cover. My wedding ring, worn thin from decades of dishes and laundry, glinted against the leather. In that moment I whispered into the stillness, "I will not fail you, Jonathan." The scarf around my neck slipped slightly and I pulled it tighter. What once felt like comfort now felt like a shield. I looked out through the cottage window at the lake, silver ripples stretching endlessly. Each wave seemed to echo the same truth: patience, steadiness, endurance. I sat there for a long time watching the water. My body was tired, but my spirit felt strangely new, like something inside me had woken up after a long sleep. I knew Charlotte would not stop. I knew she would strike again, harder. But now I no longer doubted myself. The notebook was proof. The truth was mine. That night I placed the leather book on the bedside table. As I slid beneath the quilt, the lake whispering outside, I carried one thought with me into sleep. I had been given not just an inheritance but a calling, and I would honor it no matter the cost. The second time Charlotte arrived at the cottage, she did not come alone. Her SUV pulled up the gravel drive with the same fury as before. But when the doors opened, a man in a sharp gray suit stepped out behind her. His briefcase gleamed, his smile thin and rehearsed. I did not need an introduction to know who he was. Her private advisor, the sort who profits from other people's unrest. Inside, the cottage was far from empty. Marcus sat at the table with his files neatly arranged, Claire beside him with her banking documents in order, and Thomas leaning against the wall, his steady presence filling the room. And today there was someone new. Linda Harris, an old friend of mine and a retired judge, had arrived that morning with a basket of scones and the quiet authority of someone who had signed verdicts that changed lives. Charlotte swept in first, folder in hand, her heels clicking across the wooden floor. "Mother," she began with false calm, "I've brought Mr. Kane, an advisor who understands these matters better than anyone here. He'll explain why signing over control is the only reasonable choice." The man cleared his throat, eager to take over. "Mrs. Ellison, it's very common in cases like yours for assets of this size to be mismanaged. Your daughter has the education and foresight to handle things efficiently. If you'll just sign these." But Linda's voice cut through, low and steady. "Before you continue, Mr. Kane, you should know I personally notarized Jonathan's competency evaluation last year. His will was signed in my presence and I affirmed his full capacity at the time. Legally, there is nothing to dispute." Charlotte's head snapped toward her. What are you even doing here?" Linda met her glare with calm eyes. "I am here because Margaret is my friend, and I will not watch a lawful will be twisted into something it is not." The room stilled. Charlotte's mask cracked. Her voice rose, sharp with anger. "You're all against me. This is ridiculous. She doesn't even know what she's holding. 52 million in stocks and she'll waste it. She'll lose it." Her words came faster, louder, each one edged with panic disguised as fury. Marcus quietly shuffled his papers. Claire closed her folder. Thomas crossed his arms. They did not need to respond. The more Charlotte shouted, the more her case unraveled. I stood slowly, the scarf around my shoulders heavy but steady like armor. My voice was soft, yet it carried. "Charlotte." She stopped mid-tirade, chest heaving, eyes blazing. "I don't need to win this argument. I don't need to prove anything to you or your advisor. I only need not to sign." I let the silence hold after that, a silence deeper than any protest. It stretched, uncomfortable and unmovable, until even Charlotte could feel its weight. Her jaw worked, her hands tightening around the folder until the papers inside bent. She looked from me to Marcus, to Claire, to Thomas, and finally to Linda, whose calm gaze did not waver. For the first time my daughter looked small in the room, surrounded not by enemies but by truth. "I won't forget this," she spat at last. She shoved the folder into her bag and stormed out, Mr. Kane scrambling behind her. The slam of the SUV doors echoed across the lake before the engine roared and carried them away. Inside the cottage no one moved for a long while. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the mantel and the faint lap of the lake outside. I lowered myself back into my chair, my hands resting on Jonathan's scarf, my heart steady. "I didn't win anything today," I said quietly. "But I didn't lose myself, and that was enough." No one argued. No one needed to. The weeks that followed felt heavier than I had expected. I had braced myself for Charlotte's fury, but not for the slow erosion of reputation that trailed behind her. In town, whispers followed me like shadows. To some, I was no longer Margaret Ellison, the teacher, the neighbor, the wife who had once helped organize bake sales and book drives. I had become that woman, the one who clung to her millions, who locked her daughter out, who turned her back on family. I heard it first in the grocery store from two men near the produce section. They spoke without lowering their voices, assuming my ears had dulled with age. "She's hoarding it," one muttered. "Imagine keeping all that money when her daughter's struggling." The other chuckled. "Some people would rather die rich and alone." I kept my eyes on the apples, my scarf pulled snug around my neck. I did not correct them. What would words change when the rumor traveled faster than I could have imagined? At church, pews once warm with greetings now felt colder. A few old friends gave polite nods but avoided conversation. Others simply turned away. When I walked to the post office, I could feel eyes on my back, not one pair with kindness. It was as though Charlotte had painted me with a single stroke, a selfish widow guarding her treasure. One afternoon I went into the cafe on Main Street, a place Jonathan and I used to frequent after errands. The bell above the door jingled the same way. The air smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon rolls, but the comfort had thinned. I ordered my usual tea and settled into a small corner table by the window. My scarf lay across my lap, its wool familiar beneath my hands. That was when I heard them. Two women at the next table, leaning close. Voices hushed but carrying just enough for me to catch each word. "It's such a shame," the first said, stirring her coffee. "Charlotte is such a good girl, and her own mother shuts her out like that." The second sighed. "I heard she won't even share a penny. Who does that to their child? What kind of mother would rather see her daughter suffer?" The first shook her head. "A greedy one. A bitter old woman clinging to control." Their words pierced sharper than they could have known, each one landing with a sting I could not swat away. I gripped my scarf tighter, the wool bunching between my fingers. My throat ached with the effort of holding my silence. For a fleeting moment I wanted to stand to tell them everything. The threats, the lies, the way Charlotte had locked me out of my own home. But then I saw their eyes, full of certainty. They had already chosen their version of the story. My truth would only sound like an excuse. So I sat quietly, sipping my tea, letting their voices fade into the background. On the surface I looked calm. Inside I was unraveling. As I left the cafe, the air outside felt sharper, the cold cutting into my skin. I walked slowly back toward the cottage, my scarf tight around my neck, my thoughts pressing harder with every step. Am I the villain in this story? The question lodged deep, heavier than any whisper. Was I truly the one holding Charlotte back, denying her what could have been her future? Was I clinging so tightly to a promise that I had forgotten compassion? But then Jonathan's notebook returned to me, his words etched like anchors. "Amelia understands the value. Elizabeth only sees the sale." He had not chosen lightly. He had chosen with clear eyes, with knowledge of both of us and the envelope he left, the team he built. It was all because he knew this storm would come. I paused by the lake as the wind rippled across its surface. My reflection wavered in the water, fractured and whole all at once. I whispered into the cold air, I am not hoarding. I am not greedy. I am keeping a promise. The scarf brushed against my cheek, soft and steady, as if Jonathan himself leaned close to remind me. A promise made in love is not selfishness. It is stewardship. Still the loneliness remained. I carried it back inside the cottage that night, where the silence was too thick and the shadows too long. But even in that silence, even in the ache of doubt, I felt the faint pulse of resolve. I would not trade away my integrity for approval. I would not break faith with the man who had trusted me above all else. And so, though the town whispered and friends drifted, I clung to the only truth I knew. I was not the villain. I was a keeper of promises. It was a gray, cold Tuesday morning when the letter arrived. Most days my mailbox held only bills, catalogs, or the occasional notice from the bank. But this envelope was different. Handwritten, my name spelled carefully in neat, slanted script. The paper itself felt worn, as if it had traveled through many hands before reaching mine. I carried it inside, set it on the table and stared at it for a long moment. Something about its weight made me hesitate. When I finally slid my finger under the seal, I unfolded a single page of lined stationery. The words were simple, written with care. Mrs. Hartwell, we wanted you to know what your husband's emergency fund meant to us. When our boat sank last winter, we thought we had lost everything. The mortgage, the children's schooling, our dignity. But because of the fund Richard created, we were able to rebuild. We bought another boat, kept our home and held our heads high. He saved not only our livelihood but our pride. We thank you for continuing what he started. We believe in you. It was signed the Calder family. Names I knew only faintly from the harbor. People Jonathan had mentioned in passing but never elaborated on. My vision blurred as I read the letter again, each word landing with a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I pressed the page against my chest and before I knew it, tears slid down my cheeks. But they weren't the bitter tears of loneliness or doubt that had haunted me in recent weeks. These tears carried something different. Release, recognition, a reminder that I was not as alone as I had believed. I sat at the kitchen table, the scarf around my shoulders catching the dampness of my face. Outside, the lake glimmered faintly under a pale sun, the ripples steady, eternal. And inside, for the first time in weeks, I felt a warmth that no rumor could erode. The town could whisper, friends could drift, even Charlotte could scream, but here was the truth in ink. What Jonathan had left behind was never just numbers on a ledger. It was dignity. It was the lifeline for families who might have otherwise drowned. It was proof that wealth, when held with steady hands, could protect more than property. It could protect people's sense of worth. I traced the words, "We believe in you," with my fingertip, letting them settle deep into me. For so long, I had measured my strength against Charlotte's accusations, against the suspicion of neighbors. Now I saw that strength was not in how loudly I defended myself, but in how quietly I carried on with the work that mattered. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in the small cedar box where I kept Jonathan's notes and my own unspoken words. It belonged there, among promises and truths that defined more than wealth ever could. As the tears slowed, I whispered into the empty room, "You were right, Jonathan. It isn't about the money." My voice trembled, but not with weakness. It trembled with clarity. The portfolio, the shares, the estate, they were never trophies to be fought over. They were instruments of stewardship, tools to preserve not just our family's legacy, but the dignity of others who had less to lean on. For weeks I had asked myself, am I the villain? But holding that letter, I felt the answer bloom inside me. No, I was not cruel nor greedy. I was the keeper of a promise that stretched beyond myself, beyond Charlotte, even beyond Jonathan. It reached into lives I might never fully know, yet whose gratitude now reached back to me. I closed my eyes and let the silence fill with something new. Not loneliness, not fear, but connection. For the first time since Jonathan's death, I felt part of something larger than my own grief. When I opened my eyes again, the lake still rippled, the scarf still warmed my shoulders, and the letter still rested in the cedar box. Nothing around me had changed, yet everything inside me had shifted. I was not alone. I have often wondered what happens behind the walls I am not invited into. What words are said when the door closes? What silence lingers after? For weeks, all I saw of Charlotte was her anger. But now I knew there was a world beyond that anger, one Jonathan had built and one I was entrusted to protect. Sharp, cutting, relentless. But one evening, truth slipped through, not in her voice but in what I overheard. I had gone into town to pick up supplies, and on my way back I passed the cafe. Through the window I saw Charlotte sitting alone, her phone pressed to her ear, her expression brittle. I slowed without meaning to, the scarf around my neck tight against the wind. Her voice carried just enough for me to catch fragments. "Jason, you're not listening," she said, her tone high and strained. "I can't keep covering everything. The mortgage, the credit cards, the trips you insist on. Do you think it all just pays for itself?" She paused, her free hand clenched around her coffee cup. "You promised the deal would close months ago. Now the bank keeps calling me. I can't be the only one holding this together." I should have walked away. It was not my place to stand there to hear the cracks in her voice, but my feet stayed rooted. "I need you to show up for me," she continued, her voice breaking just slightly. I need someone to see what I'm carrying." A silence followed, her jaw tightening as she listened. Then she gave a bitter laugh. "Of course, always another excuse. Fine, forget it." She ended the call and stared at the table, her shoulders sagging. For a moment, she looked nothing like the polished woman who had stormed into my cottage demanding signatures. She looked small, tired, the same young girl I once tucked into bed after nightmares. Only now she was battling her own monsters, ones I could not soothe with a lullaby. I turned away quickly, not wanting to intrude further, but the image stayed with me. Later that night, as I sat by the lake, I thought of what I had seen. Charlotte's fury had a source I had almost forgotten to consider. Her own life. A husband who treated her as an afterthought, debts that weighed heavy, the constant hunger for validation in a world that measures worth in possessions and appearances. This did not excuse her cruelty toward me. It did not soften the way she had tried to strip me of dignity, the way she had locked me out of my own home. But it made her sharper edges more complicated. She was not just a villain in my story. She was also a woman drowning, clutching at anything that might keep her afloat, even if it meant pulling me under. The next day I saw her again in town. She wore her usual armor, heels, blazer, hair tied back, but her eyes were ringed with shadows. She passed me without a word, chin high, but I carried the memory of her voice in that cafe. For the first time in weeks I felt a thread of something unfamiliar. Pity. Not forgiveness, not yet. But pity for the part of her that was still that little girl who once begged me to stay an extra minute at bedtime, who wanted to be seen, to be enough. I realized then that Charlotte's battle was not just with me or with Jonathan's will. It was with the gnawing fear that she was invisible in her own life. I sat with that thought for a long time. It would have been easier to keep her in the role of antagonist, to paint her in the stark black and white lines of selfishness and greed. But life is rarely so simple. Charlotte was both, the daughter who wounded me and the woman who carried wounds of her own. That realization did not absolve her. It did not mean I would surrender to her demands, but it deepened the story I was living. This was not just a fight over money. It was a reflection of how pain unspoken and unmet can twist into ambition, resentment, desperation. That night, as I folded Jonathan's scarf and set it beside my bed, I whispered to the empty room, "We are all carrying something." The difference, I thought, was in how we chose to bear it. Charlotte bore hers with claws. I would bear mine with steadiness. The idea came to me one morning as I sat at the kitchen table, Jonathan's scarf looped around my shoulders, a mug of tea warming my hands. The dividend statement lay open before me, rows of numbers steady and unassuming. For months, these figures had been the center of conflict, proof to some that I was hoarding, proof to me that I was keeping a promise. But staring at them that morning, I realized something simple. Money by itself is only static. It needs motion, purpose, direction. Jonathan had always known that, and now it was my turn to act on it. So I called Marcus and Claire. I told Marcus and Claire I wanted to establish a fund in Jonathan's name, not for grand projects or flashy donations, but for something humble and steady just like him: scholarships. Opportunities for young people from harbor families who often lived on the edge, who worked hard but never quite had enough for tuition or training. Jonathan had grown from that world. So had I. It seemed only right that his legacy flow back into it. Within weeks, the papers were drawn. The Hartwell Fund was born, built from a portion of the dividends, carefully structured so the principal would never be touched. I kept the announcement quiet at first, afraid Charlotte might twist it into another weapon. But word has a way of moving, and before long applications trickled in, letters written in earnest, some shaky with misspellings, but all carrying the same plea: a chance. The day the first group of students arrived at the cottage, the air smelled of lake water and spring blossoms. I had baked bread that morning, the scent filling the rooms where I had once sat alone in doubt. Now chairs were pulled close, notebooks opened, voices buzzing with nervous energy. There was Jacob, the son of a fisherman whose boat had broken down last winter. He wanted to study marine engineering so he could one day repair vessels instead of watching them sink. There was Leah, her hair in a messy braid, who dreamed of becoming a nurse after losing her grandmother without proper care. And there was one small girl, too young to apply herself, but who came along with her older sister. She had wide eyes and clutched a crayon drawing of a boat she insisted was Mr. Jonathan's. As we gathered in the living room, I spoke softly, my hands resting on the back of a chair. "This house was once my refuge," I told them. "How I wanted to be a place of beginnings." Jonathan believed in patience, in steady effort, and he believed that every generation deserves its chance to grow stronger than the one before. The students listened, some nodding, others scribbling in notebooks as though my words were more than memory. I handed out envelopes, each containing a scholarship certificate signed under the seal of the Hartwell Fund. Hands trembled as they received them. Eyes filled with tears. The room pulsed with something far greater than money. It was hope passed from one set of hands to another. When the little girl with the drawing climbed into my lap, she looked up at me with a shy smile. "Thank you, Grandma Hartwell," she whispered. The words startled me, cutting deeper than I expected. Grandma. I had heard it once from Charlotte when she was small, warm and unguarded before ambition hardened her voice. To hear it now from a child not of my blood but of my heart felt like a balm. I hugged her close, the scarf slipping down to brush against her hair. "You're welcome, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick. In that moment I understood the truth. Family is not always who shares your name but who shares your hope. The cottage no longer felt like a hiding place. It had become something new, a lighthouse, a place where light spread outward, not in grand beams, but in steady glows, touching those who needed it most. That night, after the students had left, I sat again by the window, the lake shimmering under the moon. The scarf lay folded across my lap, and the cedar box beside me held not just Jonathan's letters, but the thank you note from the Calder family and the first scholarship applications. My life had shifted in ways I had never imagined. I was no longer merely defending an inheritance. I was shaping it, giving it a pulse beyond my grief. I whispered into the stillness, "We did it, Jonathan. We found the way forward." For the first time since his death, I did not feel alone in the room. The morning of the tribute dawned clear, the lake shimmering with a calm that felt almost deliberate. Volunteers had arranged rows of folding chairs along the shore, their metal legs sinking slightly into the soft ground. At the edge of the water, just beneath the willow trees, a stone bench stood newly placed. Its surface was smooth, the engraving simple, in memory of Jonathan Hartwell, husband, neighbor, steward of the harbor. I wrapped Jonathan's scarf around my shoulders before stepping forward. The scent of pine carried through the air, mingled with the faint aroma of grilled fish from the community meal being prepared nearby. People gathered slowly, fishermen with weathered hands, families with children tugging at their sleeves, students clutching folders from the Hartwell Fund. Some faces were familiar, others I barely knew. Yet all had come because Jonathan's life had touched theirs in some way. When the time came, Marcus introduced me with only a few words. I stood before the crowd, my palms resting lightly on the podium. For a moment I simply looked at them. The murmurs quieted, replaced by the rustle of wind against the lake. My husband had spent his life with numbers. I began, my voice steady though my throat tightened. Share prices, dividends, market reports. To many those numbers were all that mattered. But to Jonathan they were never just figures. They were roofs over families' heads. They were meals on kitchen tables. They were futures waiting to be unlocked. I paused, letting the silence settle. People shifted in their seats, leaning in. 52 million in stocks, I continued, is not a trophy. It is a responsibility. One Jonathan carried with patience and one he entrusted to me. When the waves rose, he believed in steady hands at the helm. And today I tell you this. Those shares are not locked away. They are working. They are becoming scholarships, emergency funds, and second chances. They are becoming hope. The words surprised even me, their truth resonating deeper than I expected. I glanced at the students in the front row, their young faces glowing with nervous pride. When you see a portfolio, don't see money. See the fisherman's wife who keeps her home after a storm. See the child who makes it to college when odds said she never would. See dignity preserved quietly, like a flame kept alive in the dark. For a long moment no one spoke. The air was still, heavy with reflection. Then I saw it, the subtle nods. One man brushed at his eyes. Another woman pressed her lips together and looked down, her hand on her child's shoulder. The silence itself became an answer, a quiet agreement stronger than applause. When the ceremony ended, we walked together to the bench. I traced Jonathan's name with my fingertips, the stone cool beneath my skin. Behind me, people laid flowers, small tokens, even folded notes tucked beneath the seat. It was not fanfare. It was something greater. Recognition born of truth. I sat for a while after the crowd dispersed, the scarf snug against my neck, the lake rippling gently before me. Jonathan once told me, "The measure of wealth isn't what you keep but what you set free." Looking at the bench, at the people who had gathered, at the fund beginning to take shape, I knew he had been right. It was not a battle won with signatures or threats. It was a victory marked in silence, in shared understanding, in the steady beat of community. And in that silence I found my own peace. It arrived on a quiet afternoon, tucked between a bank statement and an alumni newsletter. The subject line was plain, a proposal. For a moment I almost didn't recognize the sender. Charlotte Hartwell, my daughter's name, staring back at me after months of silence. I sat at the kitchen table, the lake glimmering outside the window, Jonathan's scarf draped across the back of the chair. My hands hovered over the mouse, hesitant. A part of me wanted to close the laptop and keep the stillness I had worked so hard to reclaim. But curiosity, that stubborn companion, nudged me forward. I clicked. The email was long, carefully crafted, every sentence polished like glass. Charlotte described a new investment venture she was leading. Waterfront developments in nearby towns promising high returns, modern growth, a chance to bring progress to communities stuck in the past. She wrote in clipped professional tones, as though she were speaking not to her mother but to a potential partner. At the end, her words softened just slightly, though not enough to warm the page. Given your position and your access to the Hartwell portfolio, I believe this could be an opportunity for us to work together again. It may also serve as a step toward rebuilding what was lost between us. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. The phrasing struck me. Not rebuilding us. Not mending our family. But rebuilding what was lost. To her, even our bond sounded transactional, a line item, not a lifeline. For a long while I simply stared at the screen. My chest felt heavy, not with anger but with a tired sort of recognition. Charlotte hadn't changed. Or perhaps she had, just not in the way I once prayed for. She was extending a hand, but not in reconciliation. It was the hand of a businesswoman eyeing the resources she believed should have been hers. I stood and walked to the window, pressing my palm against the glass. The lake rippled gently in the afternoon sun. A family of ducks glided across the water, unbothered by anything beyond their course. I envied their clarity. When I sat back down, I draped Jonathan's scarf across my lap, the wool grounding me. I thought of the bench with his name carved in stone, of the students who had called me Grandma Hartwell, of the letters from families whose dignity had been preserved because of Jonathan's foresight. Those were the partnerships that mattered now. Not ventures built on speculation and fragile promises, but bonds built on trust, on quiet acts of faith. I opened a new email, my fingers poised above the keys. My first impulse was to explain, to soften the blow, to remind Charlotte of the choices that had brought us here. But then I remembered the lesson these past months had carved into me. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are care, for myself, for the legacy Jonathan left, for the people who now depended on the Hartwell Fund. So I typed slowly, each word deliberate. Charlotte, thank you for thinking of me. I will not be participating in your project. I wish you the best in all that you pursue. That was all. No accusations, no defenses, no cracks for her to slip arguments through. Just a clean line, a graceful severance. Before pressing send, I looked once more at the scarf. Its fibers worn but strong. Jonathan had given it to me decades ago for warmth, but it had become something more, a symbol of steadiness. I touched it lightly, then clicked send. The whoosh of the email leaving was final but not crushing. There was no satisfaction, no bitterness, only relief, like setting down a weight I had carried long past its usefulness. I closed the laptop and returned to the window. The ducks had reached the far shore, the sun stretching longer across the water. I whispered softly, not sure if the words were for Jonathan, for myself, or for the silence around me. It's enough. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the truth settle in my bones. I had not won or lost. I had simply chosen peace. The afternoon sun dipped low, spilling gold across the lake. I sat on the porch of the cottage, a steaming cup of tea warming my hands, Jonathan's scarf draped across my shoulders. The wool smelled faintly of cedar, a comfort that reached deeper than the chill in the air. The wooden boards beneath my chair creaked gently as I leaned back, watching the ripples shift and settle on the water. It struck me how stillness could carry its own kind of strength. Months ago, I would have filled the silence with questions about Charlotte, about the choices Jonathan made, about my own worth. But here on this porch, with the scarf snug against me and the tea pressing warmth into my palms, I found myself whispering the truth I had learned. Boundaries are not built to push others away. They are meant to keep us from drifting too far from ourselves. For so long I thought survival meant saying yes. Yes to duty. Yes to sacrifice. Yes to whatever my family demanded. Now I knew the quiet power of no. Not a no of bitterness, but a no that said, this is where I stand and this is where I remain whole. The lake shimmered as the sun lowered further, painting streaks of orange and pink across the sky. I thought of Jonathan, his laugh echoing from years past, his steady hand placing the scarf around my shoulders on some long-ago winter night. I thought of the students who would soon carry his name into their futures, of the families who had already been lifted by his foresight. That was legacy. Not dollars, not signatures, but lives steadied quietly in times of storm. I raised the cup to my lips, savoring the tea's warmth, and let my gaze rest on the horizon. Somewhere out there, Charlotte was walking her own road, carrying her own burdens. I could not control the path Charlotte would take, nor would I try. All I could do was keep my own compass true. Behind me, the cottage glowed softly with lamplight. A place once of refuge now turned outward, a place of beginnings for others. I felt the circle closing, not in finality but in a way that opened again. The scarf, the tea, the lake. They were small things, but they anchored me in something larger than loss. I breathed deeply and spoke once more, almost to myself, almost to whoever might one day hear this story. If you have ever been forced to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, which would you choose? I let the question linger because it was not just mine. It belonged to anyone who had sat in silence, weighing the cost of their own worth against the comfort of others. It was not a question with easy answers, but it was one that deserved to be asked aloud. The light shifted again, softer now, as if the day itself was preparing to rest. I watched the last glimmers dance on the water and felt a quiet assurance settle in me. This was not the end. It was simply another beginning, shaped by choice, by dignity, by the knowledge that it is never too late to start again. I thought of Jonathan, of the life we had built together, and of Charlotte, walking her own road with her burdens. I could not dictate her journey, but I could honor the lessons, the promises, and the legacy we carried forward. The cottage, the lake, the scarves, the quiet moments of tea. They were reminders that the world could be steady and true, even when hearts were fragile. I smiled softly, letting the silence stretch, carrying a peace I had earned through months of trials and reflection. Some paths are ours to shape, some are not, and that is the quiet miracle of life. Wherever you are, whoever you are, remember, sometimes the miracle does not knock. It waits quietly until you are ready to open your heart. I rose, scarf around my shoulders, and turned back toward the warm glow of the cottage. The lake shimmered, steady and eternal, and I knew that the story continued. Not just for me, not just for Charlotte, but for anyone who chooses dignity, patience, and quiet courage over the clamor of expectation.